Well, hello, everyone. It's good to be with you, as always, to process through these somewhat difficult subjects. Um, and of course, they're all related to the terrible tragedy that two families in our community suffered, and by extension, that we all suffered. And so on Monday, we talked a little bit about God and suffering, and how do we reconcile faith and belief and connection to a world beyond this one, connection to God and spirituality in a world where there is so much suffering. And today I want to talk a little bit about notions of justice. In other words, how do we frame our relationship to the criminal justice system that is just beginning for the alleged perpetrator of this horrible crime? What are Jewish conceptions of justice and the administration of justice? And also, what are Judaism's conceptions of reconciliation, restitution, and repentance? How do we view that? In other words, is there a way for a person who has committed a terrible crime to be restored back to the community and back to a healthy relationship with us? As I said on Monday, and as I typically say when we discuss contemporary issues, these are just some thoughts that I have based on some Jewish wisdom that has been inspiring and meaningful to me. There are two challenges in this particular conversation with drawing broad conclusions about a Jewish approach to these matters. One of them, as always, is that there are centuries of writing about these topics, and therefore there is just so much and a huge spectrum of understanding and questions and thoughts, anecdotes, and precedent on these issues. But the second one is, I think, unique to this particular topic, because when we talk about justice and the administration of justice, we are by definition talking about authority and community coercion and state coercion. And from the year 70 of the Common Era to the year 1948, we Jews have not had the capacity to institute and administer a coercive system of justice because we didn't have a state. So as with our last discussion, there are lots of conversations in the Hebrew Bible about justice and its administration, including a lot about capital punishment, that disappeared and became completely reinterpreted when the rabbis began to take over, because they were now subject to a justice system that was not their own. They were minorities living in other countries. So they were very careful about how they wrote about these matters, lest they be implicated by their own words. And you're going to see that. So like with Monday, I'm just going to share some thoughts, share some texts with you, and then open it up for conversation and questions. So screen share. Okay. So the first question comes right out of the Torah and the way the rabbis understand the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And the question here is, what is the balance between coercive authority on the one hand and social contract on the other? I mean, I'll give you an example. So it's been illegal for children to smoke cigarettes for a very long time. We had laws about this, but kids smoked until there was essentially a new social ethic that evolved that made smoking no longer socially acceptable. So it wasn't so much the authority and the law that stopped kids from smoking cigarettes. It was really more the community creating a value that everyone accepted, that was a new kind of coercion that helped to stem the tide of children smoking, and really of adults smoking cigarettes too. Although obviously adults still smoke cigarettes, it's far less than it used to be. I think one of the things that makes the tragedy of these two kids being killed by a drunk driver, allegedly, so painful is that even with drunk driving, obviously there have always been laws against it, and obviously people still get killed because people get behind the wheel of a car while they're drunk or while they're intoxicated. But anecdotally, when I talk to kids about this, there's just no way they would ever do it. And part of it is community coercion. Again, it's just not socially acceptable to do. And also, now we have new tools. Uber and Lyft make it, very easy not to have to do that. So the balance that I'm interested in is between authority and, when you have laws and when you have punishments. Number one, is it effective? Number two, is it a deterrent? Because that's another piece of this, right? We have laws and we have punishments to deter people from engaging in crime, and the tension between that and whether or not community coercion is more effective. I'll just lay out there. So my conversations with law enforcement and with attorneys, if the person who is allegedly the drunk driver here, if he's convicted or if he pleads guilty, he'll probably go to prison, I'm told, for 10 to 15 years. I happen to think that's a travesty. I'm not a lawyer. And by the way, speaking of that, I want to make it clear that although we're talking about matters of the legal system, the judicial system, non-lawyers, those of us who are just engaged citizens, we should be the primary drivers of this conversation, because the people who write the laws and administer the laws effectively, thank God, in a democracy, work for us. So we have an active role to play here. So as a citizen, I would say that someone who kills two 14-year-old kids should spend a lot more time behind bars than just 10 to 15 years. People who are convicted of financial crimes spend a lot more time in prison than that. So part of what I'm struggling with here is my own anger at the legal system, and about, again, whether or not punishments and whether or not making something illegal is a deterrent. So we first encounter this when the Torah is given at Mount Sinai. So here's just a section from the giving of the Torah, Exodus chapter 19. On the third day, as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning and a dense cloud upon the mountain, and a very large, loud blast of the horn, and all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their places. Now here, this is important. They took their places. In the Hebrew, it says tachtit hahar, tachtit hahar. Now, the word tachtit is related to a Yiddish word that you all know. The word is tuchas, which means tush, right? In Hebrew, the word tachtit means, I'm seeing a lot of laughter here. The word tachtit means underneath. So the translation here is they took their places at the foot of the mountain, because that's really the only way you can conceive of it. But the Hebrew actually says, literally, they took their places underneath the mountain. Underneath the mountain. So that, of course, gave rise to a lot of commentary, and I'm going to share two sections, one from the Talmud, one from the Mishnah, deciding, what does it mean that as the law was given, the people stood taktithahar under the mountain? So a certain Galilean taught before Rabbi Hizda, blessed be the merciful one who gave the threefold Torah to the threefold people through a third born on the third day of the third month. So what does that mean? Threefold Torah. That means the Torah, that means the Bible. Well, it could mean several things, but I think it means the Bible, the prophets, and the writings. It could also mean the Bible, the oral tradition, and then the codes that come after. So, but it refers to all of Jewish teaching, threefold people, that is the priests, the Israelites, and the Levites, the three different categories. The third born, who is that? That's Moses, because Moses had an older brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam. Third day of the third month. With whom does this agree? With the rabbis. So, okay, so that's the story. What does it mean that they received the Torah at this time? And they stood at the base or under the mountain. Was it at the base or was it underneath? Rav Avdimi ben Hama ben Hassa said, this teaches the Holy One of Blessing overturned the mountain upon them like a cask and said to them, if you accept the Torah, it is good. If not, there will be your burial place. So what does it mean? It means that the people accepted the Torah under coercion. They didn't freely accept it. God threatened them and said, either you accept my Torah or I'm going to kill you. Rabbi Aha ben Jacob observed, this furnishes a strong protest against the Torah, i.e., since the people were coerced into the covenant, they are not responsible for the agreement. How can you be held responsible? I mean, it's like if you know, like they show sometimes in movies and in TV shows where, you know, where people are coerced into confessing, or where we hear about people being tortured into confessing. They're not confessing. They're just trying to stop the pain. They're not accepting the Torah. They're just trying not to die. Said Rava, even so, they reaccepted it in the days of Chashverosh. This is the Purim story. For it is written, they, the Jews, confirmed and took it upon them. They confirmed the Torah, what they had already accepted. So this is at the end of the Purim story, after the Jews are saved, after Esther speaks up to the king and Haman is killed. I'm sure most of you know the story. They reaffirm the covenant. So that means that from the time of Mount Sinai until the time of Purim, the people were not freely accepting the covenant between God and the Jewish people. They followed the laws because they were terrified not to. So this is about the state scaring you into doing the right thing. I pay my taxes gladly. I gleefully pay my taxes. But I imagine there may be some who pay their taxes because they're afraid of getting caught and going to jail for not paying their taxes, right? So the threat of punishment, is it a deterrent against committing a crime? And if you are only following the law because you're afraid of getting arrested, are you really acting with integrity? Or are you simply acting out of fear? That is the question raised by this Talmudic text. Now we go to the Mechilta, where it says, and Moses took out the people, right? So that's the image in the Torah. Moses led the people out of the camp toward God. Rabbi Yossi said, Rabbi Yehuda was wont to expound, and he, Moses, said, Adonai, God came from Sinai. Do not read it thus, but to Sinai, to give the Torah to Israel. So in other words, it's not that the people moved toward God, it's that God moved toward the people. But I do not say this. Rather, I say God came from Sinai to receive Israel. So in other words, both of them are moving toward each other in covenant to create this new relationship as a groom goes out to receive his bride. So the acceptance of the covenant in this instance is not about fear. It's not because I'm going to do it because I don't want to die, or I'm going to do it because I don't want to get caught, or I'm going to do it because I don't want to go to prison, or I'm going to do it just because it's easier to do it as opposed to run the risk of public shame or embarrassment or whatever. In other words, I'm not performing this act out of coercion, but rather I'm performing this act, I'm accepting these responsibilities out of love. And if we're talking about a bride and a groom, we are saying that both parties are essential in this covenant. If you are following the law only because you are being coerced into it, you are far less important than the state that has the capacity to arrest and incarcerate you. You're far less important. It's not that you're not important, but there is a real strong power dynamic between the two of you. Bride and groom, both of them are completely interdependent on each other. It is mutual love and respect that generates this covenant. That is the notion of community cohesion, and the way that community informs our decisions. And that is the tension, right? And I want to put on hold, I want us to consider, as we enter into the discussion, what you think about that tension and what you think is more effective. Is it the law? Is it the police? Or is it neighborly cohesion? Is it that I'm a part of this community, and we together create trust, and we rely on each other to do the right thing so that we can all live together? Because that's how communities thrive and flourish. They thrive and flourish when we know that we have each other's backs, that we're going to do the right thing, not just because it's the right thing for me to do, but because I care about you and I want you to be okay. And we're all in this together. That is not a power dynamic. That is mutuality. That's mutual love, mutual respect, mutual trust, a sense of neighborliness, a commitment to community, the understanding that I'm going to give up a little of my own freedom voluntarily, autonomously, because I live among you and you live among me. We live together. So that's the tension in these two texts. Okay. Now, I'm sharing with you some of the ways, just briefly, some of the ways that the rabbis have circumscribed capital punishment. And I'm doing it because I want you to get a sense of the humility with which the rabbis engaged in defining criminality. And more than defining it, in setting up a system to adjudicate it and to punish it. Now, again, the social reality here is that, you know, these are not, it's not like Nassau County coming up with new laws, or the state of New York or the federal government, where wrapped in their conversations about what the law should be are police departments that enforce the law and judges that adjudicate, and punishments that are not only set, but that can be executed They didn't have any of that. They were the subject of that in foreign lands. But nonetheless, I think there's some wisdom here. I'm not giving you all of it. I'm just going to give you a few examples of it. So first of all, then we're talking about capital cases here because we're talking about the death penalty. Capital cases had to be tried before the Sanhedrin. 23 qualified members. The rabbis say that a Sanhedrin, a rabbinical court that found someone subject to the death penalty once every 70 years was to be considered a bloody court. So they were very hesitant about capital punishment. As you can understand, that was the message they wanted to put out so that they would not be subject to capital punishment in these states where they live. Trustworthy testimony had to be presented by 2 qualified witnesses. This is really important and really instructive. There are exceptions that were made in times of war when people were killed on the battlefield and yet there were no witnesses to it. There are examples of that where the courts allowed testimony from one person because if a married man, as an example, was not declared dead because there were no witnesses, even though it was clear that he was killed in battle, then his widow could not remarry. But under most other circumstances, 2 witnesses, circumstantial evidence not admitted. So this is the example the Talmud gives. I saw a man chasing another into a ruin. I ran after him and saw a sword in his hand dripping with another's blood and the murdered man in his death agony. I said to him, "You villain, who killed this man? Either I or you. But what can I do? Your life is not delivered into my hand, for the law says at the mouth of 2 witnesses." So a very strict standard here. And since many murders are not conducted in public, very difficult. And again, it's not about whether or not a person is guilty of murder. It's about whether or not the threshold rises for capital punishment. Then a couple of other things that are interesting. No blood, no one related by blood or marriage could give testimony, could be a witness. This is an interesting one. Among the qualifications for someone who could adjudicate a capital crime were they use these examples: an old man, a eunuch, and a childless man, one who is hard-hearted. What they're essentially saying here, and what further discussion in the Talmud and in the codes suggests, is that they want people who can identify both with the victim and with the person who is accused. So they're saying if you live a life that doesn't give you existential connection to the people who are accused or the people who are victims, then that disqualifies you. And again, no secondhand knowledge either. So the reason I'm sharing this with you is because it suggests humility in the process of rendering justice, that the legal process should reflect the understanding that human beings are flawed. And so the system should protect against our flaws. And that's why these standards are so high. It is about humility. It's about understanding that the stakes are very high and we human beings are necessarily limited. You know, one of the critiques of capital punishment is precisely the finality of it. You can't, if you make a mistake, you can't rectify it because the person is dead. And we now know that a lot of mistakes are made. And we know that a lot of those mistakes are categorized racially as well. We know these things now. We've got a lot of research on it. We've got we've had states where very Republican governors have suspended capital punishment because of this, because there isn't enough faith in constructing a legal system that can prevent the wrong person being executed. So that's that. Now I want to move into the question of restitution and repentance and reconciliation. And I want to commend, for those of you who are interested in this topic, a wonderful book, a good book to read, by the way, in preparation for the high holidays. It's called On Repentance and Repair, Making Amends in an Unapologetic World. It's by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. Alana actually shared it with me. She's very good friends with the author. And among the things that she does that I found just so important and instructive is she takes what are called in Hebrew Hilchot Teshuvah, that is the laws of repentance that were written down by Maimonides, and she makes them very accessible. And so here they are. What is the process by which one is restored from sin? Restored from sin. One, and this, by the way, we're talking about it within the realm of, you know, people who are accused of crimes, but I think it also obviously has wisdom for us in our interpersonal relationships too. So here we go. First step: when you are the perpetrator of a sin, when you've harmed someone else, when you've committed a crime or a sin, or when you have in some way injured another person, first step: recognition of your sin as a sin. That's the first step. It involves knowing that certain actions are sinful, recognizing such actions in oneself as more than just lapses of behavior, analyzing one's motive for sin as deeply as one can. The first step is overcoming defensiveness, overcoming diffusion of responsibility, a skewing of responsibility. The first step is owning the magnitude of your actions. That's step one. Step two, remorse. Now, by the way, in each of these steps, it's not about what you think or what you feel. It's about your victim accepting that you have adequately fulfilled this step. So it's not whether you personally feel that you have recognized the magnitude of your sin. It's whether your victim sees and trusts that you have recognized the magnitude of your sin. So two, remorse. Feelings of regret, a failure to maintain one's moral standards, a feeling of being alienated from God and from one's own deepest spiritual roots of having abandoned our inner selves. My sin toward you has created alienation. Another way to frame this remorse is understanding the magnitude of the injury you caused to another person. I am alienated from who I should be and from the Holy One of Blessing because I have injured you. I am owning the harm and the pain I have caused. And your victim has to trust and accept that you have done that. This is a violation of the next basic human impulse, which is to say, I have said I'm sorry, let's just move on. It is blindness to the magnitude of injury that you have caused. You have to be able to fully absorb the pain that you have caused. And by the way, none of these are time-bound. It can take a long time. That leads to the third, desisting from sin. This is an action. It is a ceasing from sin, a desisting from the patterns of sinful action to which we have become addicted. Desisting from sin involves actually stopping the sinful action, consciously repressing thoughts and fantasies about the sinful activity and making a firm commitment to never commit the sinful act again. Now, again, this is not a pledge. This is a demonstration. Your victim and your community needs to trust that by having seen you over the course of time act in a different way, they can trust that you will no longer injure people in the way you injured them. It's not, again, it's not a pledge. It is a series of actions, not over any defined period of time, where your victims and your community can trust that you are a different person. So absorbing the magnitude of your sin and changing your behavior, and then restitution, the act of making good as best one can for any damage done. If one has stolen, one must return the object or pay compensation. If one has damaged another's reputation, one must attempt to correct the injury to the offended party. And this is not, I'm paying a fine or I'm paying, a settlement, because we're not just talking about, some objective administration of justice here. We're talking about making restitution in a way that your community and your victim feel that you really get it, and you've sacrificed and suffered in order to demonstrate that you really get it, and that you've changed your ways, and that you're a different person. And then, and only then, do you earn the right to apologize. The more specific the personal confession, the better. The tradition is quite clear, however, the recognition of sin, remorse, restitution, and confession, if they are done without desisting from sin, do not constitute teshuvah or repentance. Without ceasing one's sinful activity, one has only arrived at the preliminaries of teshuvah. Actual desisting from sin is what counts. So what is instructive here is that the apology comes last. The apology, which needs to be treated seriously, has to be backed up by the 4 other stages of repentance and reconciliation. First, I see this all the time. People who have harmed other people, they just want to apologize and move on. And they think that because they have apologized, they've actually accomplished something. And they have not. And all of us who have been victims of other people's bad behavior know that. That there is nothing more corrosive than an apology that is obviously insincere. And it's actually more damaging to your relationship than not apologizing at all. Because all it does is reinforce distrust. So if we think about this in personal relationships, we think about this within the context of a criminal justice system, right? How does an individual who has committed a crime earn restitution and reconciliation within their community? These are the steps. So again, just some thoughts about thinking about how we elevate a community and how we hinder damaging, bad behavior, dangerous behavior, lethal behavior. There is first this balance between authority and law and criminal justice that is backed up by the state's authority on the one hand, and the social contract that emerges, sometimes even organically within a community that we all accept because we're all in this together, because we believe in each other and care about each other and want to trust each other. So we make our decisions accordingly. You know, I think about this with regard to, you know, the conversations we used to have 20 years ago about drinking and driving, and how difficult it was if you had, you know, one parent who was going to say, you know what, I'll have all the kids drink at my house. And what that meant for the other parents who didn't want that. How does the social cohesion in a community prevent that from happening? How do we get each other to own our responsibilities to one another? Because it strikes me that when we do that, it's even more effective than the deterrent quality of the criminal justice system. The difference, as I said, between, you know, the deterrent factor and love and mutuality. And then, you know, within the criminal justice system itself, I mean, it's instructive, as I mentioned, you know, you read the Torah, and you can be, children who disobey their parents are stoned to death publicly in the Torah. It's a capital crime to violate Shabbat in the Torah. You know, there is this tendency toward authoritarianism. And we Jews recognize that when we were subjected to it, and therefore we introduced humility and an understanding of human weakness into the administration of justice. And then, of course, as I just mentioned, how does restitution happen? How does reconciliation happen? How do we climb back from the worst things we've ever done? And how do we allow others to climb back from the terrible things they have done? So those are the texts I wanted to share, and I would be grateful for your comments and questions. And for those, I'm going to turn it back over to Adrienne to administer. So thoughts, questions, please.
Rabbi, thank you so much. Everyone, again, you can feel free to type questions into the chat or raise your hand, and I will keep an eye out for you. I can't unmute anybody, but you can unmute yourselves. But we do have a question in the chat to get things started, Rabbi. In Judaism, is punishment primarily for retribution, reformation, or revenge? What is justice? Do we seek to primarily serve the victim or to repair society?
Yeah, you know, it's really, I think, an excellent question. And I would say, again, you know, the challenge is the antecedents that we have in tradition are not so instructive because they were written by people that didn't have the power of the state. So now we see a Jewish justice system that has been created because the modern state of Israel is that. And I would argue that all of the different purposes that you outlined are a part of it. And it really, it varies depending on the category of crime. Israel, of course, is a state that is surrounded by enemies. It is also subject to brutal terrorism, and so the criminal justice system is designed specifically to deal with that, and that is about keeping very bad people away from innocent people. It is about protecting the public from people who want to engage in violence against innocent civilians. So their criminal justice system and their police force operate very differently than ours do because of those particular threats. But having said that, although the death penalty is legal in Israel, it is almost never used. And so that's an interesting tripwire. You would think that in a country where terrorists plan and blow up pizzerias and bar mitzvah parties, that the death penalty would be used more readily, and yet it is not. For precisely the reasons I shared earlier. The state of Israel, which is a secular state, but governed by Jewish values, doesn't want to engage in murder, and it believes that when you kill someone that you don't have to kill, that's murder. So among the people who have been executed are Adolf Eichmann, as an example. Now, having said that, there is much greater latitude given to the police force when they engage in disrupting terrorist cells. So there is that. And I would also say, based on my conversations with people who were part of designing the criminal justice system, there's also a heavy emphasis placed on attempting to restore people back to society. There is a definite greater and thicker sense of community cohesion among the folks in Israel that lends itself to that. Now, having said that, there are a million problems and a million ways that Israeli citizens, particularly Arab Israelis, but even Mizrahi Israelis, Black Israelis, are discriminated against in the criminal justice system as well. So there is an understanding of those flaws. But all of those categories are definitely a part of the criminal justice system in Israel, which claims its roots in Jewish values and in Jewish texts and in Jewish sources.
Rabbi, thank you. How do we measure retribution? An eye for an eye? How does that square with the civil justice system?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's a fascinating one, because this is where the biblical laws regarding these matters have been completely undone by rabbinic literature. So yes, we have in the Bible eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, wound for wound, and yet the rabbis determined that that phrase refers only and specifically to financial restitution. So we think of it as, violent retribution, eye for eye. You carve out my eye, I carve out yours. But it refers specifically to financial restitution according to the dominant strain in rabbinic literature. I think this is, again, about humanizing the laws of the Bible, and also an understanding that the people who were writing these texts were minorities living in a majority non-Jewish country, that in this case, Babylonia, where if they wrote this stuff down, it could come back to haunt them. So retribution becomes restitution. That's how I would say it. It's all about financial restitution.
Does the person who killed the two teenagers qualify for the kind of steps toward forgiveness that you have been describing?
So I'm glad somebody brought it back to what we're all thinking about here. And I will tell you quite transparently that I really struggle with this. And in my conversations with attorneys, including the one I'm married to, I tend to have a more severe approach to this than I think the legal system, as it's currently constructed, allows for. So I have a few beliefs about, assuming this let's all put on the table that there's been no adjudication here. So everybody is presumed innocent. So we're gonna take a leap forward, and we're gonna make some presumptions that are not known. Assuming this guy is guilty, I assume several things. So first is he was convicted twice when he was young, but has not been convicted of a DUI in, I believe I think it's 15 years. But I do not believe that that means he has not gotten behind the wheel of a car and driven drunk before. I have no way of knowing that, but I'm operating on that assumption, and I'm also operating on the assumption that now we cannot trust that he will abstain from engaging in that lethal activity again. That's why I'm kind of horrified that he might be released on bail, and I'm told that it's very likely that he will. It's also why I'm somewhat horrified that he will only get a 10 to 15 year sentence, for two reasons. One, because I do not believe that that sentence remotely matches the magnitude of his sin. And second, because at this point, referring back to the stages of restitution and rehabilitation that we just discussed, I don't trust it. Now, that doesn't mean that somewhere down the line, many, many years down the line, because the punishment has to be commensurate with the crime, and I just don't believe that 15 years is, but maybe 25 years from now, he will have completely transformed his life. And he will have demonstrated in very concrete and consistent ways that he has met all of the criteria that we have discussed. Well, then I think it will be fair to say that even a person who has done what he has done can, over the course of decades and with tremendous work, re-earn or earn the trust of their community. I'm not saying that it will happen, but I am saying that it could happen. But I'm also saying that it shouldn't have to happen in a shorter period of time than I think is commensurate with his crime. Now, that's a very subjective thing. I am owning that. I am admitting that. I'm just one person, and we have laws and we have standards, and I don't have to agree with them. But we are all participants in this greater conversation about what is justice. And I think we all have a right to participate in it. I think we all have an obligation to participate in it. So, that is my answer, my subjective answer to this question. I think ultimately the answer is possibly. There's a possibility of reconciliation and restitution. But I think this guy should serve a very, very long time for having killed two kids, if it's demonstrated and if the criminal justice system determines his guilt.
Thanks, Rabbi. Should the owner of the bar, should the owner of the bar and the bartender who served the drinks be financially and possibly criminally responsible for the actions of the drunk driver? In other words, as enablers.
So, here is where I fall back personally, and I'm just giving you me here. I'm really just giving you me here. Here's where I fall back on that the recognition of human fallibility in rendering these decisions. I do believe strongly that this should be a consideration, that we should create a standard by which we can hold bartenders, restaurants accountable when their patrons leave drunk and kill people. I think it's a whole lot more complicated and a whole lot harder to do than that sentence, though, because we only want to hold people accountable in a way that is fair and just and objectively definable. So I gotta believe we can do that. I remember years ago when the social host law was passed by New York State, which essentially said that if an adult in a private home knowingly allowed a teenager to drink and drive, that adult was going to be held accountable, and is. But as I recall, and some of you may know differently, the punishment is pretty minor. I think it was a $250 fine, if I recall, which doesn't strike me as much of a penalty at all. I do think that we need to hold more people accountable than the person who committed the crime, if more people are implicated. I just think we have to figure out how to do that in a way that is fair and that doesn't end up catching innocent people in a web. So I don't know how to do that, but I do believe that we should figure out a way to do that.
What is the impact of forgiveness by the families and an expressed desire that he serve no more time?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
I'm not
Maybe
sure.
maybe the person who asked it can just
Richard,
unmute.
do you want to unmute, because I'm not sure I understand that either.
Yes, Rabbi. I suppose that the families of the victims in this case or other cases says that no time served by this person will bring my loved one back. And for his family to suffer like my family is suffering brings me no solace. And I think what he did was wrong, was despicable, but I forgive him because I need to go on with my life, and I don't want to hold him responsible.
Yeah. So there is some discussion in the tradition about that kind of forgiveness, Richard, which is, and I firmly believe in it, right? Because when you hold on to your anger, you continue to allow the perpetrator to victimize you. They still have control over your emotional well-being. And so this is a completely different kind of forgiveness, right? It's not a forgiveness that is necessarily attached to retribution or to punishment or to justice. This kind of forgiveness is offered not for the perpetrator, but it is offered as a pathway for healing for the victim.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, but I certainly, the second part I agree with, but the first part I think is also, I think the actual act of forgiveness is supposed to help the perpetrator as well as the victim.
Well, thank you for that correction. It may. I don't know that we can objectively evaluate that. And now I'm talking again about people who have committed heinous crimes. Like I'm thinking about the murderer in Charleston, and the fact that the families of the victims forgave the murderer. And that was a religious and spiritual act. I don't know, I don't think any of us can know what effect it had on the murderer, because it was a generous, autonomous act that also helped those families and those victims heal. And it also, again, was completely separate from the execution of justice in that case. I would argue that there are times when it is especially healing and important to let go of our anger toward a person who committed an act, a sinful act against us, who harmed us, so that we can move on, so that they can no longer victimize us. I think that it maybe it'll have an effect on the person who perpetrated the crime. Maybe it'll help them toward on their own process of making restitution and of healing and of growing and of learning. That may all be the case, but I don't think personally, I wouldn't want it to affect the criminal justice system, in part because, again, the administration of justice happens at the beginning. It can't wait for a person to fulfill all of the steps that are required here. And second, because punishment and incarceration is also about the greater community. It's about taking people out of the community that can harm us still. So I want to honor your question, because I think I didn't mention it, and I think it's really important. All of us hold grudges, all of us, and it's not healthy for us. And it may be that the person who harmed us doesn't deserve our forgiveness, but we let go so that we can move on, and so that they don't have the ability to continue to hold that power over us.
2 comments, Rabbi. He is facing a maximum of 8 1/3 to 25 years and possibly consecutive time. There is also the consideration of inducing a plea so as to avoid having the families go through the misery of a trial. Linda, I think that was from you, if I'm not mistaken. Yep.
Hey, Linda.
She's waving. And Edie commented, people seem to be on many drugs today. They are smoking marijuana and drinking as well. A person may not be recognized as drunk, but his judgment or her judgment could be way off, and especially at 11 o'clock at night. How would that be judged by the bartender?
Yeah, this is the question. I mean, that's why I'm hesitant to answer, because it seems to me to be very complicated. But I would like us to, as a society, to struggle with that question, because I do think that there is greater culpability than just the individual actor sometimes, and I think that we need again, this is about a community coming together and protecting, and individuals at all levels protecting each other, and it's about the legal system acknowledging that and figuring out a way how to parse that out. And it's complicated to do, really complicated to do, but I do think it's important to engage in that work and in that conversation, if it can be done in a way that's fair, and in a way that is just. With regard to marijuana, I'll just tell you one interesting story. So I guess about 12 years ago, there was a rabbi in Westchester who was pulled over for driving while under the influence of marijuana. And it happened right before Yom Kippur. And it was a public thing, and he was arrested. And, he went before his community on Yom Kippur and says, "This is Yom Kippur, so I'm so terribly sorry." And there was a very interesting conversation within that synagogue about whether the rabbi should continue to be able to be the rabbi there. And there were ultimately, he stayed and retired from the congregation, but there were the conversation itself, which was in the press. You can look it up. That's why I can talk about it. Was fascinating, and parents were saying what kind of an exemplar is this for our children, and how can we pay attention to anything he says regarding moral living and standards and abiding by our tradition's values and priorities. And others said, but don't we believe in forgiveness, and every human being is flawed, and he made a mistake? And it was an interesting conversation. I hold that conversation with my confirmation class every year. It's one of the topics we discuss. We talk about forgiveness over the course of several sessions. We talk about Frank Tassone as the former superintendent as one of the case studies, and we talk about this rabbi as another. And I will tell you, over the course of the years that I've been doing this with my confirmation class, almost to a person, everybody's willing to forgive the rabbi. Everybody, they're all willing to forgive the rabbi. This year, the kids came to me right before confirmation, which was this past Friday night, and said, I think maybe we're going to need to rethink that. So lived experience and the potential for harm, it's a very important ingredient in this conversation. And I think that sometimes as a society, we are more dismissive of it than we need to be. And I don't think we prioritize in ways that we should. So Linda gave us what this guy could get. The families told me that they met with the district attorney who told them that they think that the sentence will be 10 to 15 years. Bernie Madoff got, I think, 115 years for stealing people's money. I think we need to engage in a conversation about our priorities and whether our laws conform with them. And the criminal justice system laws are flawed because they're written by us and we are flawed. But I am particularly horrified by these things, just particularly horrified by them. And part of it is because of what I do and because of the kids I've buried over the years. But I brought this conversation to you to some degree as a therapy session for me, because I'm particularly horrified by all of this. So anyway, so whoever wrote that comment, Edie, it was you bringing in marijuana. And marijuana is a big thing right now. It's legal. Lots of people smoke. We could have the same issues. And I do not believe that the laws will solve those problems. I do believe that community cohesion might. Something we have to work on together.
Rabbi, one final question. You spoke about forgiveness and letting go. Do you think one can let go without forgiving?
I'm going to just speak personally here. I think that letting go is about shrinking that person's place in your head. That's what I think it is. I think it's about making that person, the person who harmed you, small. I think that's what it is. I sometimes think of it as putting a piece of glass between you and them so that their capacity to twist your heart is no longer there because that influence can't get through the glass. I think that a component of letting go can be about forgiving. It can be. It doesn't have to be, and it might not be, but it can be. It can be about contextualizing that person's behavior, a deeper understanding of who that person is. And all of that is about making that person smaller inside your brain. All of it is. And when we do that, then we bifurcate that emotional connection. And that's how we can heal.
Rabbi, thank you. And to all our Sinai folks, thank you so much for being here. I think that this series hopefully is a big step towards
just one final comment to those of you who are still on. Somebody today who I love said to me that Monday's conversation was frustrating, and I agree. These very weighty and complicated topics don't lend themselves to solutions. And this conversation, I hope you'll see as just a part of a greater conversation, both internally and communally, about how we manage these very complicated, weighty, profoundly important issues about who we are in relationship to one another, about what we stand for as a community, about how we keep each other emotionally, psychically, and physically safe, and how we trust each other. And that's not, these are not, you don't answer those questions in an hour on a Zoom. This has got to be ongoing hard work. And it's about understanding our limitations. And it's about understanding our commitment to each other. And it's about working together to move forward a little bit, one step at a time. And I think, if anything, these past 2 weeks have reminded us that this conversation needs to be an ongoing conversation. So I hope we'll continue to do that, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. Really love seeing all of you. We'll do this more.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.